I'm not a musician, so I never really felt the need to comment on this. It's one of those things where I'm just like, this is slightly out of my wheelhouse. I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. I'm not an expert, blah, blah, blah. But I've seen this come up so many times now that I do think it needs to be addressed, right? It needs to be brought up and it needs to be condemned, honestly. The weird condemnation of video game music from the music listening audience. Like, oh, video game music isn't real music. Why? Like, it just isn't. Like, the reality is, I've listened to popular music. Every time something comes on the radio, I cringe. Why? Because it's all crap. The most popular artist, the biggest name in music, legendary individuals like Eminem and Taylor Swift, right? The biggest names in the industry, they're not talented people. They don't put out good content. I never want to listen to it, never want to hear about these people again. They are scum. Meanwhile, I listen to video game music all the time. Recently I've been listening to Donkey Kong Country's Tropical Freeze's soundtrack. Horn Top Bop is a favorite. And you also have, Metroid music and just all-time classics, right? And what makes video game music better than the Taylor Swift slop? Like, what makes it better? It has no political agenda, right? When you really process this, when you really think about it, when you really think about what these artists are doing and what they're pushing and why they're in the media all the time, you begin to realize that like modern musicians or celebrities in general are essentially exist to try and push weird political ideas onto the public. Taylor Swift screaming "fuck the patriarchy" where she during a concert where she talks about where she sings about getting her back blown out by all these different guys, right? Taking "fuck the patriarchy" like way too literally, right? When you actually process that, when you actually realize that like all these people are terrible, like Eminem coming out like I don't want Trump supporters as fans. Why? Like again, this is their real purpose. This is their real job essentially is to socially manipulate the public. But video game music, in comparison, is pure, right? It has no political agenda. It is simply pleasant to listen to. It is simply better than the mainstream slop you hear on the radio, right? And that frightens the music industry. That frightens the music audience. Like the fact that like there are people like me who understand this and appreciate this about video game music is appalling, right? Like to them, this is like a huge affront to everything they stand for because these musicians are major major tentpole brands of like their identities, right? I know plenty of people who revolve their entire lives around music, like, oh, Jack Black, he's so funny. He has a maxed out stat and charisma. Like, okay, but is his music technically good? Is he a good person? Like, what does he do, right? When you really think about it, like when you really examine the lyrics, the melodies, the compositions, uh, the music from these big names all fall way short of the average Nintendo video game track, right? And it's just something that the music industry doesn't want to admit because it's embarrassing that they're getting outdone by a group of people that aren't in their field, right? That randos on a Nintendo on Nintendo platforms can just outperform them without even really trying, without even really meaning to. And it's kind of like the whole literature thing or the whole manga versus comics thing. Like they uh they desperately need people to cling on to like the established brands, the big names, the brands that are famous for being famous, right? Instead of the stuff that's actually good, the stuff that's actually enjoyable, the stuff that actually has time and talent and soul put into it, right? when you compare something like Lord of the Rings compared to like modern fantasy, the difference in quality is very clear. Even if you're like me and don't like Lord of the Rings all that much, when I compare that to modern slop, people like Fonda Lee, like you just see this huge gap in quality. Generally speaking, of course, like good stuff will always exist, and it'll always be acknowledged. But right now, like you're not supposed to care about quality. You're not supposed to care about like the actual content of what you're listening to. You're supposed to just consume every Taylor Swift song that comes out. Like, oh, Taylor, Tay Tay, I love you. Like, you're supposed to obsess over it, obsess over her lifestyle, her relationship with that quarterback. You're supposed to get invested in the Super Bowl. You're supposed to go get the COVID shot. Like, you're supposed to vote Democrat. You're supposed to do all of this stuff, and more and more people aren't doing it, right? Like again, I find myself more and more noticing that these celebrities whose entire purpose is to sell you on weird political ideas are not succeeding in what they set out to do. Like Taylor Swift cannot swing elections. People really thought that she would have some sway when she came out politically in 2020. But no, like all that's done is like artificially lengthen her career because the political establishment now has an investment in her to do so. But she's not smart enough to do it. Like she isn't going to change anyone's mind. Like she's not insightful at all. If anything, like this is just making more people who don't agree with her politically or don't agree with her handlers politically against her. Right? Like again, these people don't have the amount of control over people that they did in the 80s and 90s. Like they don't have a John Lennon, they don't have a George Carlin, like they don't have people like personalities that people were worship decades later, right? Because they don't have the talent for it. Not that like they ever did, but back in the day, people would screech about like, "Oh man, the Beatles are the biggest brand in history." Like, "Oh, George Carlin is a philosopher. He's more than a comedian." Like, people would listen to discourse like that and like believe it. But now that you can just kind of like look up these people on YouTube, now that you can like look up like smaller bands, right? Like I can tell you from experience, like there are people on the street in my town that are performing better music than like the top the top artists today. Like that's just incontrovertible. That's just observable reality. They're just better at it because they actually put in the time to practice. They actually have talent. They actually go out and do stuff, right? Like, and again, if you actually take the time and listen to it, if you actually take the time to make the comparison, it's it's very noticeable. Like modern music is complete trash. So terrible that anybody can do better.